show, do you watch your movies? But I'm curious, do you ever watch your movies?
No.
You've never watched one of your movies?
Oh, if I had...
Long before Steve Carell became one of television's most beloved stars, he was just the youngest of 4 brothers, growing up in the quiet town of Acton, Massachusetts. His family had no Hollywood connections, no insider advantages, and no reason to believe one of their own would someday redefine comedy. His father worked as an electrical engineer, while his mother spent long nights as a psychiatric nurse. Watching her return home exhausted left a lasting impression on young Steve. He later admitted that making her laugh became one of his biggest goals, and those simple moments unknowingly shaped the performer he would become. Even then, he wasn't chasing fame. He simply loved making people smile. That humble beginning would later become the secret ingredient behind every unforgettable performance, especially Michael Scott. But before millions knew his name, Steve had to survive years that tested whether his dream was even possible. And those struggles would end up defining everything that came next. Success didn't arrive with a standing ovation. It came with rejection after rejection. After graduating from Denison University, Steve packed up and moved to Chicago, where he immersed himself in the legendary Second City comedy scene. Like countless aspiring performers, he balanced auditions with ordinary jobs just to pay the bills, even spending time working at a post office while waiting for his big break. Then, in 1996, opportunity finally knocked when he landed a role on The Dana Carvey Show. On paper, it looked like the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. In reality, the series was canceled after only 7 episodes, becoming one of television's biggest disappointments. For many actors, that kind of failure could have ended a career before it truly began. Instead, Steve treated it as a lesson. Industry insiders noticed something special about him, even if audiences hadn't yet. What they saw would soon change his entire future. Following that setback, Steve found a new home as a correspondent on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. While the program wasn't yet the cultural giant it would eventually become, it gave him something even more valuable: visibility among some of the smartest people in comedy. His field report stood out because he never played the joke. Instead, he became the joke without ever realizing it, delivering absurd lines with complete sincerity. That unique style made every sketch feel believable, no matter how ridiculous the situation became. Writers, producers, and directors began remembering his name. Hollywood wasn't calling every day just yet. But inside the entertainment business, Steve Carell was quietly building a reputation as someone capable of stealing scenes without demanding attention. It was only a matter of time before a major opportunity landed in his lap. And when it did, everything accelerated almost overnight. That breakthrough finally arrived in the early 2000s. Steve appeared alongside Jim Carrey in Bruce Almighty, and despite sharing the screen with one of comedy's biggest stars, audiences couldn't stop talking about the awkward, hilariously earnest news anchor Evan Baxter. Soon after came Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, where Steve played the clueless weatherman Brick Tamland. The character had relatively little screen time, but his bizarre one-liners instantly became fan favorites. Suddenly, moviegoers wanted more of Steve Carell. Producers noticed that he possessed something incredibly rare. He could make audiences laugh without relying on over-the-top antics, because he committed completely to every ridiculous moment. Among those paying close attention was producer Judd Apatow, who believed Steve wasn't just a great supporting actor, he had everything needed to carry an entire movie on his own. That belief would soon launch him into an entirely different league. When The 40-Year-Old Virgin hit theaters in 2005, everything changed. Co-written by Steve Carell and Judd Apatow, the comedy became an unexpected box office sensation, earning more than $170 million worldwide and transforming Steve into one of Hollywood's hottest stars almost overnight. Audiences connected with Andy Stitzer because beneath all the awkward humor was a genuinely kind man trying to find his place in the world. Even the infamous chest-waxing scene, filmed using real wax and very real pain, became one of the year's most talked-about comedy moments. Overnight, Steve went from dependable supporting actor to leading man. Ironically, just as Hollywood was opening every door imaginable, another project was quietly preparing to change television history forever. NBC had already cast him in a small workplace comedy called The Office. At the time, almost no one could have predicted that this series, not his blockbuster films, would become the role that defined an entire generation. NBC believed adapting the hit British series The Office would be a gamble, but one challenge stood above all the others: finding the right actor to play the boss. The original version's David Brent was intentionally uncomfortable to watch, and simply copying that performance wasn't going to work for American audiences. Several respected actors were reportedly considered, including Paul Giamatti, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Bob Odenkirk. Then Steve Carell walked into the audition. Instead of playing Michael Scott as an idiot, he portrayed him as someone desperately wanting to be liked, and that tiny difference changed everything. Producers instantly realized they'd found the heart of the entire show. Before we get into how that decision would eventually lead to one of television's biggest behind-the-scenes controversies, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Because what happened after Steve became Michael Scott is something very few fans ever knew. When The Office premiered in 2005, the reaction wasn't exactly what NBC had hoped for. The first season leaned heavily on the British version, making many viewers feel like they were watching a copy instead of something original. Critics were divided, ratings were only average, and some executives reportedly questioned whether the series even deserved another season. Behind the scenes, the cast had no idea if they'd ever return after those first 6 episodes. It was a tense period where one cancellation notice could have ended the show forever. Fortunately, producer Greg Daniels and the writing team realized something had to change. Instead of making Michael Scott simply awkward and unbearable, they started revealing the lonely, insecure man hiding beneath the cringe-worthy behavior. That creative shift would completely transform the series and launch it into television history. Season 2 felt like an entirely different show. Michael Scott was still painfully awkward, but viewers suddenly understood why he acted that way. His desperate need for friendship, approval, and belonging made him strangely relatable, even during his most embarrassing moments. Steve Carell mastered the impossible balance of making audiences laugh one second and genuinely feel sorry for Michael the next. The chemistry between the cast also exploded, turning characters like Jim, Pam, Dwight, and Stanley into household names. Ratings jumped dramatically. Critics reversed their earlier opinions, and The Office captured the Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. Steve himself won the Golden Globe for Best Actor, confirming what fans already knew. This wasn't just another sitcom anymore. It had become one of the smartest and most beloved comedies on television. But while the show was soaring higher than ever, Steve's career outside Dunder Mifflin was growing just as quickly. Over the next several years, Steve Carell found himself living 2 incredibly successful careers at once. During the day, he was America's favorite regional manager, creating unforgettable moments that fans still quote nearly 2 decades later. At the same time, Hollywood couldn't get enough of him. Films like Evan Almighty, Get Smart, Date Night, Despicable Me, and Crazy Stupid Love proved he was more than just Michael Scott. Despite his growing movie career, Steve never treated The Office as a stepping stone. Cast members repeatedly described him as one of the most dedicated people on set, always arriving prepared and setting the tone for everyone else. That commitment made what happened next even more surprising, because just as everything seemed perfect, one simple interview would quietly start a chain of events that no one saw coming. In April 2010, Steve gave what seemed like an ordinary interview to the BBC. During the conversation, he casually mentioned that his contract would end after season 7, and that it would probably be his last. It wasn't a dramatic announcement, and it certainly wasn't a resignation. He was simply speaking honestly about where things stood at that moment. Most actors in his position would naturally expect the network to respond with a new offer, or at least begin discussing an extension. After all, The Office had become one of NBC's biggest success stories, and Michael Scott was the face of the entire series. But instead of opening negotiations, something unexpected happened. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and the silence from NBC became impossible to ignore. What happened behind those closed doors would eventually rewrite everything fans thought they knew about Steve Carell's departure. At first, Steve Carell didn't panic. It was reasonable to assume NBC would eventually reach out. After all, his comments to the BBC had made headlines, and surely the network would want to lock down the star who had become the face of one of its biggest comedies. But according to crew members who later shared their experiences, that call never came. Brian Whittle, a boom operator and sound mixer who worked on The Office throughout its run, later recalled that everyone expected negotiations to begin almost immediately. Instead, there was only silence. As the weeks passed, Steve reportedly began wondering if the network simply wasn't interested in keeping him around. From his perspective, no response could easily be interpreted as a response in itself. If NBC wasn't making an effort to keep him, perhaps they were ready to move on. That quiet uncertainty became the turning point, and what happened next would leave many people who worked on the show completely stunned. Years later, one of the most revealing pieces of the story came from longtime Office hairstylist Kim Ferry. She explained that Steve hadn't been looking for an excuse to leave at all. In fact, she said he had made it clear through his representatives that he was willing to continue for a couple more seasons. According to Ferry, his manager contacted NBC and communicated that Steve wanted to stay if the network made an offer. But the offer never arrived. Ferry later admitted she was heartbroken because so many fans believed Steve had voluntarily walked away. She insisted that wasn't what happened, describing the situation as confusing and deeply disappointing for everyone who worked closely with him. Her comments completely challenged the public narrative that had existed for years. Suddenly, fans were asking a different question. If Steve wanted to stay, why didn't NBC do everything possible to keep him? Kim Ferry wasn't the only person to question how the situation unfolded. Casting director Allison Jones, who had helped build the show's unforgettable ensemble from the very beginning, later described the entire situation as asinine. That single word spoke volumes. Other members of the production team echoed similar feelings, saying they couldn't understand why the network appeared so passive when it came to retaining its biggest star. To them, Steve wasn't just another actor whose contract was expiring. He was the emotional center of the series. Without Michael Scott, The Office would inevitably become a different show. Looking back, many crew members believed the warning signs were there, but no one with the authority to change the outcome stepped in. As more behind-the-scenes accounts surfaced over the years, a picture began to emerge that was far more complicated than fans had ever imagined. But there was another factor that may have influenced everything. Around that same period, NBC was going through major leadership changes. Bob Greenblatt took over as chairman of NBC Entertainment in 2011, and several people connected to the show later suggested that The Office no longer had the same level of support from the network's top executives as it once had. While there has never been public confirmation that any one executive deliberately pushed Steve out, multiple behind-the-scenes accounts have suggested that the changing priorities inside NBC affected contract discussions. It's important to separate confirmed facts from speculation here. What is documented is that Steve's contract expired and no new agreement was reached. The reasons behind that have been debated for years. Whether it was miscommunication, shifting corporate priorities, or simple inaction, the end result remained the same. One of television's most valuable stars was preparing to leave, and the show's future suddenly looked very uncertain. Rather than rushing Michael Scott out the door, the writers decided to give the character the farewell he deserved. Instead of ending his story with failure or disappointment, they chose something far more meaningful. Michael finally found lasting happiness with Holly Flax, the one person who accepted him completely, flaws and all. Their relationship gave viewers something they'd waited years to see. A version of Michael who no longer needed constant approval because he had finally found someone who truly understood him. Every episode leading toward his departure carried extra emotional weight, even though most fans had no idea what had been happening behind the scenes. The cast knew they were saying goodbye to the man who had shaped the identity of the show, and the atmosphere on set became increasingly emotional. But nothing could have prepared them, or the audience, for the unforgettable farewell that was still to come. When the time finally came to film Michael Scott's farewell, emotions weren't just part of the script, they were completely real. Steve Carell's final episode, Goodbye, Michael, became one of the most emotional moments in sitcom history. Instead of making his departure loud or overly dramatic, the writers focused on quiet, heartfelt goodbyes with each member of the office. The most unforgettable moment came at the airport, after Michael secretly said goodbye to everyone except Pam. She rushed to catch him before his flight, and the cameras captured an emotional exchange that still gives fans chills today. Steve later admitted he expected to stay composed, but was completely overwhelmed by the experience. Cast members have shared that tears were flowing both in front of and behind the cameras. For many of them, it didn't feel like saying goodbye to a character. It felt like losing the person who had held the entire cast together for 7 unforgettable seasons. But Steve's next chapter would prove he still had plenty left to show the world. After leaving the office, many viewers assumed Steve had finally achieved the goal everyone believed he had been chasing all along: a full-time Hollywood career. On the surface, it certainly looked that way. He returned to the Despicable Me franchise as Gru, reunited with the cast of Anchorman 2, and continued appearing in major studio comedies. Yet behind those familiar roles, something different was happening. Steve wasn't simply looking for bigger paychecks or blockbuster hits. He began searching for projects that challenged him in completely new ways. Rather than staying inside the comfortable world of comedy, he quietly started exploring dramatic roles that many people never expected him to take. It was a bold move, especially for someone so strongly associated with one iconic television character. Some critics questioned whether audiences would ever see him as anything other than Michael Scott. Steve never argued with them. He simply let his performances answer the question, and the first one would surprise nearly everyone. That transformation arrived with Foxcatcher in 2014. Steve disappeared beneath heavy makeup, subtle prosthetics, and a chilling performance as John DuPont, creating a character so unsettling that many viewers didn't immediately recognize him. Gone was the awkward smile and lovable optimism that had defined Michael Scott. In its place was a quiet, deeply disturbed man whose every movement felt uncomfortable to watch. Director Bennett Miller reportedly wanted audiences to forget they were watching Steve Carell altogether, and that's exactly what happened. Critics praised the performance as one of the biggest surprises of the year, and Steve earned his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Overnight, Hollywood stopped viewing him as the funny guy from The Office and started recognizing him as one of the industry's most versatile actors. It was the kind of career reinvention few comedians ever achieve. But Steve wasn't finished proving just how wide his range could be. The years that followed only strengthened Steve's reputation. In The Big Short, he delivered a sharp, emotionally layered performance that helped earn the film widespread acclaim. Then came Beautiful Boy, where he portrayed a father struggling to help his son through addiction, showing a level of emotional vulnerability that reminded audiences how powerful restraint can be. Later, in The Morning Show, Steve took on perhaps his most morally complicated television role yet. His character, Mitch Kessler, wasn't someone viewers were supposed to admire. Instead, he represented a deeply flawed man trying, and often failing, to confront the consequences of his own actions. It was a risky role that stood in stark contrast to the lovable Michael Scott, proving once again that Steve had no interest in repeating himself. Every performance pushed him further away from being typecast, while quietly confirming that his talent had always extended far beyond comedy. And ironically, even as his career evolved, the role he left behind was becoming more popular than ever. One reason Steve's dramatic performances worked so well is that he understood how to build complex characters from the inside out. Michael Scott and Mitch Kessler might both have enormous blind spots, but that's where the similarities end. Michael desperately wanted people to like him, and often embarrassed himself while chasing that approval. Mitch, on the other hand, struggled to understand the consequences of his own behavior, making him a far more unsettling figure. Steve approached both roles with complete sincerity, refusing to play either character as a caricature. That commitment is what separates great actors from unforgettable ones. Looking back, it's remarkable that the man who made millions laugh every week could also deliver performances that left audiences deeply unsettled or emotionally devastated. Yet while Steve was building one of Hollywood's most respected careers, something unexpected was happening to The Office. Years after its finale, the show was about to become even bigger than it had ever been during its original television run. Just when it seemed The Office had reached the peak of its popularity, streaming completely changed its legacy. Years after the final episode aired, the series found a massive new audience on Netflix. People who had never watched the show during its original NBC run suddenly discovered Michael Scott, Jim, Pam, Dwight, and the rest of the Dunder Mifflin family through endless binge-watching. Before long, The Office became one of the platform's most watched shows, outperforming many brand-new originals. Memes flooded social media, classic scenes went viral, and younger viewers began quoting episodes that had aired over a decade earlier. Instead of fading into television history, the sitcom became even more influential than it had been during its network run. Ironically, the character at the heart of that success had left years before, making many fans wonder how much bigger the series could have become if Steve Carell had stayed just a little longer. But Steve's own reaction to the show's second life was surprisingly humble. When Steve eventually learned just how enormous The Office had become in the streaming era, his response wasn't filled with pride or celebration. During an interview, he was told that the sitcom had become one of the most watched shows on streaming, attracting millions of new fans around the world. His reaction was incredibly simple. He smiled and replied with one word: good. That understated response perfectly reflected the kind of person colleagues had described for years. Rather than taking credit or revisiting old frustrations, Steve seemed genuinely happy that the work itself continued to bring joy to people. He rarely speaks publicly about the circumstances surrounding his departure, choosing instead to let others tell that story. In an industry where many stars openly criticize former employers, Steve's silence has only strengthened his reputation as one of Hollywood's classiest performers. But despite his quiet approach, one question continues to follow him everywhere. Could Steve Carell ever return to The Office? It's a question fans have been asking for years. Cast reunions, podcast conversations, anniversary specials, and interviews have kept the speculation alive, especially as former co-stars continue sharing behind-the-scenes memories. Steve has consistently expressed his love for the series and the people who made it special, but he's also suggested that Michael Scott's story reached a satisfying conclusion. At the same time, new projects connected to the Office universe have reignited interest, leading many viewers to hope for at least a surprise appearance. So far, there's been no confirmed plan for Michael Scott to return in a major role. While rumors often spread online whenever a new project is announced, none have resulted in an official comeback. Still, the possibility is enough to keep longtime fans dreaming. And perhaps that's part of what makes the character so unforgettable. People simply aren't ready to say goodbye forever. Looking back, the biggest surprise isn't that Steve Carell left the office. It's how many people misunderstood why it happened. For years, the common belief was that he walked away because Hollywood offered bigger opportunities. But the accounts shared by crew members paint a far more complicated picture. According to those who were there, Steve was open to staying, and the opportunity to continue simply never materialized. Whether the outcome was caused by corporate indecision, changing leadership, or missed communication, one thing is clear. Television history might have unfolded very differently if those contract discussions had gone another way. Instead of celebrating one of the most successful partnerships in sitcom history, fans were left wondering what could have been. Sometimes the biggest turning points don't happen because someone makes a dramatic decision. They happen because no decision is made at all. In the end, Steve Carell's story isn't really about leaving the office. It's about professionalism, humility, and making the most of every opportunity that follows an unexpected setback. Rather than publicly criticizing NBC or dwelling on what might have been, he focused on growing as an actor, taking on challenging roles, and building one of the most respected careers in Hollywood. Meanwhile, Michael Scott continued making millions of people laugh, proving that truly great characters never disappear. They simply find new audiences. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of this entire story. A single unanswered contract negotiation changed television history. Yet Steve chose grace over resentment and let his work speak louder than any interview ever could. Now we'd love to hear from you. Do you think The Office would have been even greater if Steve Carell had stayed for a few more seasons? Or did the show end Michael Scott's journey at exactly the right time? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed uncovering the real stories behind your favorite stars, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives like this. Until next time, thanks for watching.